Welcome to The Cow Behind the Barn, a podcast exploring humanity, the world, and the divine as experienced and interpreted by an artist. I'm Kevin Caldwell, a co-founder of the Table Collective. What is consciousness? That question has fascinated and perplexed people in the fields of philosophy, science, religious heritages, and spiritual traditions, and in various artistic genres, including, but not only, science fiction. And it's done so for centuries. It's not merely an abstract question. The answers that have been proposed all reach to the very core of who we are, how we understand the very nature of ourselves. If you've been following any of the episodes, you know that along the way I have frequently paused to say, that is a topic for later. And typically that comment has been prompted by the fact that I was beginning to say things related in some way to consciousness, in what I call its big C or its small c dimensions. The reason for those pauses came about because a simple question had become the framework for the entire podcast. Where and when did I begin? Where and when led to the explorations of space and time, the nature of the cosmos and the past and the present and the future. And now, where and when did I begin has led to this point, standing as it were on the porch, about to knock on a door, and I expect it will open into the unexpected, into vast rooms and hallways that I can imagine may be there, but which I know will only become known as I enter and explore. Now, this time I'm going to begin with some stories. First, the whale. I came across the One Planet podcast, and I heard Nan Hauser, president of the Center for Cetacean Research and Preservation, talk about her experience as she was filming underwater when a whale swam directly at her, placed her on its nose, repositioned her at various points along its body, and at times covered her with its large fins. She said it was at times terrifying, given the size and power of the whale, but then she noticed a killer whale in her vicinity and realized the whale had been protecting her. It was exhibiting something that was very similar to what other whale researchers have noted, which is that whales exhibit altruistic behavior towards other species, an altruism that some researchers attribute to empathy. Consciousness? The rainforest. In May, in a 2024 article in Atmos, Romany Williams wrote, quote, "In 2014, after nearly 2 centuries of efforts by the Tuho Nation in New Zealand, the Te Urewera Act," I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly at all, that act was established, and it was a precedent-setting law which granted formal legal personhood to the rainforest. Similar efforts are being brought forth by indigenous nations across Turtle Island in an effort to preserve our precious, often voiceless, wild ecosystems. A rainforest being granted legal personhood. Consciousness? My mother. A more personal story. Some years ago, my mother had a sudden stroke, the result of which was that her ability to communicate ebbed away over the course of a few days. Within a week, she became fully non-responsive. While it had been my sister who found my mother, and thus my sister who had the most traumatic experience, my brother and I also formulated the scene in our imaginations as we listened to her, and thus we had our own secondary levels of trauma. So one evening I suggested that the 3 of us try an imaginative meditation experience or experiment to help us address the inner emotions and memories. We all silently imagined or recalled the scene, and I asked us each to invite Love, capital L, to be present. Now, because we each shared something of a Christian heritage, I named Love Jesus in this case. I encouraged each of us to imagine the scene with Love, capital L, present, in any way that our minds suggested. After several iterations of imagining various aspects of the scene, I said to my brother and sister, "What do you want to say to Love or to Jesus?" My mother had not spoken in days, and had not indicated in any way that she was aware of our presence or of our words. But as soon as I said, "What do you want to say?" she responded, "I love you, Jesus. I love you, Jesus. I love you, Jesus." Consciousness. The Rock. And I don't mean I don't mean the celebrity. When I was 18 or 19, I wrote a short fictional story about a rock on the side of a mountain. It was told from the rock's point of view, in first person singular. I imagined experiences of the rock as time passed, as its environment changed. I submitted it for publication, and though it was refused, and by the way, I heartily endorse the reasons, because it had all the marks of late adolescent writing style, one editor did take time to comment on the intriguing nature of the concept and encouraged me to keep writing. The story implicitly asked the reader to suspend reality and join in imagining a world in which a rock has consciousness, a sense of self, and what that would be like for the rock. Consciousness? Each of these stories in different ways raises questions about the nature of consciousness and about the nature of what it means to be a self, what a self is. Some of the questions about consciousness and the nature of the self that come immediately to mind include, for me, what do we mean by consciousness and by self? How do self and consciousness relate to each other? Are they the same or different, and different in what ways? And then a lot of related questions follow for me right away. Given that human beings, for example, change developmentally relative to our consciousness and our sense of self as we grow from childhood into adulthood, and when our cognitive functions decline with the aging process, including when some of us are swallowed by some form of dementia, what does consciousness mean? What's a self in each stage and in each case? In infancy, in childhood, in adulthood, old age, dementia. Another set of questions: are there other kinds or levels or types of consciousness and selfhood, not just within humans, but in other beings or things? Sometimes I refer to small and big C consciousness and small and big S self to contrast the individual with something more than individual, a collective or divine consciousness. But why stop at two? Big C, little c, big S, little s. Might there be a whole taxonomy of ways of being conscious, ways of being selves? Do quantum theories of the universe and physics have insights for this? Quantum theories of consciousness need to be explored in connection with all of this, especially the question of whether there might be some sort of cosmic level consciousness, and if so, what is that? What about the questions that more and more are involving AI? Could a computer or programmed thing become a self? Does it have consciousness? Can humans create a conscious being? I also need to include meditation and spirituality. And I'm not only asking what religions say about whether there's a divine self or a divine level of consciousness, and if so, what that is. That is an important topic, and I'll be including it in an episode or maybe more. I'm also, though, asking about the effects of meditation, a word which covers a lot of different practices and mental states, the effect of that on one's consciousness, one's sense of self. Is there more to who we are than what we normally experience, for example? Now, there is another lens that I look through when I'm thinking about consciousness and the self, and it's this. We tend to have an explicit or implicit hierarchy. We tend to assume that certain types of consciousness are better than others, and often we equate better with intellectual progress or ability. Much of our educational and professional world operates with a priority given to so-called left-brain functions, though that left-brain, right-brain model is outdated. It's still very common. We tend to highly value logic and reasoning, mathematics and analytical skills, sequential linear thinking, and so we often discount imagination, intuition, and nonlinear thought, or at least we relegate those to a less reliable way of knowing. As such, people who exhibit less prowess at what we value in intellectual functions, we often tend to devalue as people. Our views of consciousness and the self have potentially very significant results then in how we see other people and things and animals. And I'm going to come back to that point in a bit. But speaking of other ways of knowing, like imagination and intuition, this seems like a fitting juncture to pause and share a poem that I began to write while preparing for this episode. I'll share it here without a lot of comment other than to say that it's my imaginative and intuitive way of processing how I currently, at least, understand consciousness. It's a poem called Roomscape, and it might be worth listening to a few times or even going to the written text of the poem, which we include, by the way, on our Table Collective website in the blog section, which you can find at tablecollective.art. Here's the poem, Roomscape. Roomscape. Lead marks on paper from a pencil, moved by fingers, moved by hand, moved by bone and muscle, moved by tendon, sinew, nerve, moved by a thought shot down the path of pulse and synapse to the pencil point on a paper. In the moment of the pencil moving, tracing a thought on dull paper pulped flat from the soles of trees, further up and further in, up the hand, arm, neck, inside the gray tissue, inside the skull, another thought is already born, formed and sent on its way before the old thought finds the period on the paper. In the room, two cats playing, purring, pausing, staring into the dark hallway at the things cats see in the spaces beyond my sight. Inside square walls, there is a tiny orange flash of fish, moved by some liquid synapse, or lure, or longing I cannot sense. A plant above and to my right, tamed and potted in soil from the loam of some raw and wild land, spilling leaves and stems down the bookshelf's breast, trellised green and yellow. Toys are askew, scattered residue of a 3-year-old's make-believe. She sleeps in a crib that stands on a floor that is the ceiling above me. A daughter, firstborn of 3, sleeps above me to my left, mother of a firstborn of her own across the hall, not yet stirring in the crib. Behind a door to my right, another sleeper. We have 50 years of waking, walking, bed and bread, breath inhaled and exhaled, a weathered life of days together. These rooms are breathing. The night has inhaled a passing day, held its breath deep in moonlight lungs up to the point of exhale, releasing a tomorrow that will be today, a wind that will carry us afloat from dawn down to dusk and the next breath swallowed in deep. The woman breathing, the daughter and the daughter's daughter breathing, the cat breathing, the fish breathing. I am breathing. I inhale the breath of the breathing room, into lung, to blood, to brain, down the muscle and tendon and bone, down to fingers laced around a pencil, to the dulling point scratching, to the traces of lead on paper, to lines shaped into sticks, circles and twists and spots. The gray dust on paper is inhaled by other eyes. They draw in deep the scratches of the pencil on the page, into lung, to blood, to brain, down again through muscle and tendon and bone and vein. There's another aspect of consciousness and the nature of the self that I want to touch on here, in addition to the more philosophical questions and the practical considerations of a hierarchy of ways of knowing and thinking, which is related to how we see the self and consciousness. And that's this: there are also significant ethical dimensions to this entire conversation. Our views of what it means to be a self and conscious will affect what we then determine is or is not a self, which affects how we treat people and things in our world. If we think that someone with lesser intellect, or in a coma, or with Alzheimer's, does not display signs of consciousness and selfhood that are in keeping with our definitions, it will affect how we treat those people. Turning from human beings, Can we carry this over to plants and cats and fish, as I did in my poem? Consider for a moment why we react differently if we see someone smashing a spider versus, say, beating a dog to death. We feel differently based on our experience that a dog has feelings and is conscious in some way, whereas fewer of us imagine a spider to have those characteristics. Here again is the point. Our relationship to and treatment of people and everything in the cosmos is potentially affected by our way of understanding consciousness and the self. And so, in addition to the more theoretical and philosophical dimensions of how we see consciousness and the self, there are very real consequences in both our private actions and in public policy relative to the environment, treatment of the mentally impaired, euthanasia, and many more. This matters. It really matters. Now, in a way, this question of I, the self, consciousness, circles back to the very first episodes of the podcast in which I was exploring the nature of the cosmos to be able to answer the simple question where I began. I was asking, what is the cosmos like? I ended up with many more episodes on that topic than I anticipated, and now I'm asking really another question about the nature of the where in which we live. And that's this: is the cosmos conscious? Or at least, what within the cosmos is conscious? Now, after that long preamble, I'm coming back to the question that began this journey. When I ask, where and when did I begin, what do I mean by I? What is consciousness and the self? Now, before trying to articulate a working definition, I want to be open about my background to all of this. We all come to any discussion with a prehistory, and that history will in large part determine how we view things, the questions we ask, and the questions we don't think to ask. I didn't enter this topic with an explicit definition of my own about consciousness and the self, but neither do I arrive here as a blank slate. I have a prehistory that has probably resulted in some implicit assumptions about consciousness and the self. In my late teens, I had a number of experiences and came to certain intellectual conclusions that combined to result in becoming a devout, practicing Christian. In that heritage, I absorbed what was taught to me as a given, that we are body, soul, and spirit, and that this is the nature of the human being, the human self. I understood as well that there was a divine self, God, and other selves, conscious spirits, both good and bad, angels and demons. Now, my views on those things have changed a lot, and I think have matured and broadened and deepened, but it is in my background. In college, I took a philosophy of mind course, which probed major questions about the nature of the mind, consciousness, and the interrelationship of selfhood and consciousness with the body, and specifically the chemical processes of the brain. Later, I sought out the help of a therapist as part of my own process of personal integration and healing and wholeness. It happened that she was a Jungian, and this introduced me to the reality that much of myself was not conscious, including that shadow self which we usually prefer not to be conscious of, and the subconscious depths of myself which seem to connect with something more vast and more deep, something possibly shared in some way with all of humanity. Later still, I began to study more seriously and with greater open-minded curiosity the teachings of the Buddha, and the Bhagavad Gita, and the Quran and Tao Te Ching. This exposed me to very different ways of understanding the nature of the self and consciousness, the body, the world, and the divine. Much more recently, maybe a year or two prior to starting the podcast, I've been interested in what I call the physics of consciousness and the self. This is all a pretty cursory survey for the purpose of brevity. My aim here has been to outline some of the sources in my history for how I approach defining and understanding humanity, the divine, and what it means to be a self. Now, to talk about something, we have to know what it is. So I need to clarify a definition for consciousness and the self. I'm going to begin by just listing some of the definitions that I've come across, And then without a lot of debate, I'm going to share what I'll use as a working definition or approach for the purpose of the podcast. Here's a list of some of the definitions I've discovered. Consciousness is the state of being aware of experiences. Or, the self refers to the concept of one's identity. Consciousness is the ability to experience, and the self is the entity that does the experiencing. One is conscious and a self if one is both aware and aware of being aware, including being aware of remembering and aware of being other with respect to other selves and things. Consciousness is the state of being aware of yourself and the world around you. It's a subjective experience unique to each person. Consciousness is just a meaningless universe of matter. It's an illusion. Consciousness is a function of the neural activity of the brain. Conscious and unconscious mental and physical attributes make up the self. The self is a subjective experience that's central to selfhood, which seems a little circular to me. The privacy of this experience is one of the many problems in the study of consciousness. And finally, a more poetic or perhaps existential definition I came across is this. Consciousness is everything you experience. It's the tune stuck in your head, the sweetness of chocolate mousse, the throbbing pain of a toothache, the fierce love for your child, and the bitter knowledge that everything eventually will end. Now, let me talk a bit about my approach. What I notice in these widely varying descriptions is that definitions of consciousness and the self have different mixes of three things: experience of the environment and stimuli, awareness of those experiences, and the awareness of having that awareness. Now, different definitions from my list include or exclude those or see them differently, but I see them as common enough that they have shaped my approach. And my approach is to describe four dimensions of consciousness and the self. There's one-dimensional consciousness and self, experiencing what happens, but not aware of experiencing it. A two-dimensional consciousness or self experiences what happens to it and is aware of experiencing. Three-dimensional experiences what happens, is aware of experiencing it, and is aware of being aware. And then not four-dimensional, but what I'll call multidimensional, because I don't know, there could be more than four. This is that realm that is beyond the human level, the subconscious, the divine, the collective, and that's something we'll need to explore. So in coming episodes, I will try to explain more about these different dimensions. I'll use these as sort of my outline, drawing again from philosophy, science, religion, and from my way of seeing and experiencing all of it as an artist. And in keeping with that last statement, I'll end this episode with another poem, which was inspired recently as I was meditating on and considering the insights of the Buddha and the nature of the self. As with the prior poem, I'll present it here without further comment and just invite you to re-listen or read it in print and to receive it with your imagination. It's called A Feathered Flying Thing. What you see is a flying thing, all veins and plumes and hollow shafts, hooked quills, blood feathers, pens, in flight from nest to limb to wind to branch and back again. You see the feathered thing, tracing air, open-winged, on waves invisible as light. You see, but I know. There is no bird, no follicles, no skin, only feathers covering layers of feathers attached to and held together in a hollow fullness. These feathers that I am, this I that is a we, this single plural of feather, first, second, third person, I is not here. Yet this reeling feeling of feather lifting, feather in the wind, a shape of move and hover, that is me. I am the feathered flying thing you see. Well, what is consciousness and what is the self? Real? Not real? Empty? full, singular, plural, less than all of that, more than all of that, other than all of that? In upcoming episodes, I'll come back to all of this and to the 4 dimensions that I've introduced. Until next time.